This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. In this week's episode, we're looking at two different approaches to combining gender inclusion with traditional faiths. The first gay synagogue, as it calls itself, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, has its fascinating history told by former Assistant Rabbi Ayelet Cohen in the book Changing Lives, Making History. And for writer Eve Tushnet, coming out as a lesbian was a natural part of her adolescence. But when she converted from Reform Judaism to Catholicism, that led to a new wrestling among her gender and her faith. She writes about her journey in Gay and Catholic, accepting my sexuality, finding community, living my faith. But first, here's my interview with Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. The first ever real gay synagogue, right? Beit Simchat Torah. It's been around for what, 40-odd years, and it's a pretty fascinating story, kind of how it got started, how it got to where it is today. Yeah.
So CBST, Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, was founded in February 1973. So it was the very, very beginning of the gay rights movement. A lot had been happening in New York in terms of civil rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Organizations were being founded, but in the Jewish world, this was still something that nobody talked about. And as Jews in New York were realizing that it was more and more possible for them to live their lives as openly gay and lesbian people, they wanted to be able to do that as Jews as well.
And your association with it is kind of fascinating because you were a rabbi there in one role or another for a number of years, and you referred to it as your dream job and so forth. But you're straight. How is it that you developed your personal commitment to this role?
So I came to CBST as a rabbinical student intern when I was a student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Conservative Movement's rabbinical school. And I was studying at JTS, really benefiting from the work that activists had done before me to make it possible for women to become rabbis in the conservative movement. And I was very aware of the fact that those barriers still existed for people of LGBT experience, that you could participate in Jewish life up to a point and then started reaching barriers.
One of the things that that comes naturally with progressive efforts is that they naturally kind of reach their end. How has CBST kind of evolved over the years, especially in the very recent years where kind of acceptance and welcoming has become seemingly just rather rapidly quite a lot greater?
When the synagogue first existed, it was about the fact that such a thing could be, and helping people find that it was possible. So in terms of a place of affirmation, in terms of helping to push the conversation forward so that mainstream Jewish communities and synagogues started to really look at their own policies and their own systems of including or excluding people of gay and lesbian experience. It became a place to explore liturgy and make sure that the language of prayer and the language of Jewish rituals reflected LGBT experience. Now, it's also the cutting edge in terms of the transgender Jewish experience. So rituals for gender transition, really educating synagogues, rabbinical schools, the Jewish community about what needs to happen next. There's a lot of work that has to still be done within the Jewish sphere and then also in the political sphere.
And now Eve Tushnet on being gay and Catholic. Gay and Catholic, and I think important for understanding for people who haven't read the book, celibate, right? So how did you come to that in life? I mean, there's a lot there.
So I was raised in a fairly secular progressive household, so I didn't have a lot of baggage relating to Christianity or the Catholic Church. I had a lot of misconceptions, but not a lot of sort of emotional baggage. And when I was in college, I met people who for the first time were really talking to me about their faith. And a lot of what they said I found really striking. So when I entered the church, it was just, I did ask them things about the sexual ethics of Christianity and got a range of relatively unsatisfying answers. But you know, I don't remember if I used this analogy in the book, but there's a way in which any kind of conversion is more of a love story, right, than a like philosophical proof. And if you end up in that place where you've really fallen in love with this religious body, you want to be in kind of as deep a relationship with it as possible. For me, that meant kind of taking on trust, the church's teaching authority.
And you grew up also Reformed Jewish. He's largely secular, but also Reformed Jewish.
Right.
Your writing is a bit peppered with the Yiddishisms and what have you. And so tell me about that transition from, from that kind of childhood into Catholicism.
On the one hand, I think that the amount of Jewish education that I had as a child was really helpful, just in terms of making it normal, making sort of the questions of religion and of religious community a normal thing that people have to wrestle with, instead of it being kind of weird and out there. There's something sort of inescapable, kind of sticky, right, about a Jewish upbringing that, Philip Roth gets into this a ton. You can't escape. And I think that was helpful. I will say, when I started exploring more kind of the intellectual side of religious faith and not just the practices that we were taught in childhood, the things that were most striking to me tended to be kind of explicitly Christian and even Catholic concepts. So like the Incarnation, the Crucifixion, the Eucharist, which meant that I think a lot of people wonder, well, why don't you just be an Episcopalian? Or for that matter, why don't you just explore Judaism like you were raised? But it's because the specific concepts that were first most striking to me were pretty deeply embedded in Catholic faith.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression from the way you put it is that, and perhaps people would say predictably so, coming out as a lesbian to your parents in the early 90s was a fairly non-controversial thing, whereas coming out as someone who's going to be Catholic some 6 years later was quite another thing.
I mean, I think they were both challenging for my parents. My parents were really supportive of both, and really, I think one thing that very few strong-willed parents realize is that genetically they're likely to have strong-willed children, but my parents have always been pretty good about recognizing that. And so they were really accepting. I think that they did have to kind of readjust their expectations, both when I came out as gay and then later when I said, well, actually, I'm going to become Catholic. And I think it was challenging for them. I think in a certain way, it's a bigger rejection to take on a different religion.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast, available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowa Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast and the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.